morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Mariam Golnaraghi, and I'm the Director of Climate Change and Environment at the Geneva Association. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this Geneva Association Risk Conversation on net zero and nature positive leveraging insurance in the economic transition. Today also is the first day of the United Nations 15th Conference of Parties Framework Convention on Biodiversity being held in Montreal, Canada, where 196 delegations are expected to convene with the aim to examine the overwhelming scientific evidence about human-induced nature and biodiversity loss, set new goals, and develop an action plan for protection and preservation of nature. As we know, that requires a much more sustainable approach to economic growth and development. Now, during this panel, we will discuss the findings and recommendations of our latest report on nature and the insurance industry, taking actions towards a nature-positive economy. And we will take a deep dive into a number of key areas. First, the nexus between large-scale nature loss, climate change, and economic development, and benefits of preserving natural capital. Second, factors that are driving consideration of nature into core business decision making in public and private sectors. Third, challenges with assessing, measuring, and pricing nature-related risk. And fourth, what does it all mean for insurers' core business as risk managers and investors, with concrete examples of solutions that insurers can develop and deliver. Now, before we start, just a few housekeeping points. Your mics will be on mute throughout this webinar. And to submit your questions, please click on the Q&A button on your screen and type in your questions. Specifically, please don't use the chat function to submit your questions because we won't be checking it regularly. So use the Q&A button. Now, this webinar will be 75 minutes in length. First, I will offer a short presentation highlighting key findings of the report. Then we will dive into the discussion, starting with 3-minute statements by our 4 panelists. This will be followed by a 20-minute Q&A with the panel, and then a 20-minute Q&A with the audience, and then closing remarks. Now, with no further delay, I would like to introduce our 4 esteemed panelists who are also highly experienced practitioners. First, starting with Eric Roberts. He's the Senior Manager in the area of global climate risk and resilience at the Nature Conservancy. Second, Sherry Gray. Sherry is the global lead on sustainability and market development in Public Sector Solutions Group at Swiss Re. She's based in Australia. Third is Jonathan Sharrock, who is the Vice President of Emerging Solutions and Director at Zurich, North America. And then Brian Kernohan, Chief Sustainability Officer and Senior Managing Director in the area of environment and policy at Manulife Investment Management. Thank you very much to all of you for joining this panel, and very much looking to this conversation with you. Now, before we proceed with our discussion, I would like to share a few slides summarizing key messages of our report. Now, these slides, along with the report and recording of the webinar, will be available on the Geneva Association website. Now, what is very important is that the World Economic Forum has identified biodiversity loss and human environmental damage as one of the top 5 global risks facing humanity in the next 5 to 10 years. To put this into perspective for insurers, in the 2022 Emerging Risk Radar, the Chief Risk Officer Forum also identified nature and biodiversity loss as a medium category environmental risk for insurers with significant potential impacts expected within the next 5 years. Another area that a CRO Forum also highlighted, which we highlight in our report, is what they call climate engineering, and for that they refer to risk of carbon capture and underground storage technologies as a medium category risk over longer term. In our report, we do reference potential risk of environmental risk associated with deployment of new climate technologies for decarbonization as a major potential risk to environment that we need to anticipate, assess, and account for. Next slide, please. Now, there is a tremendous scientific evidence that has emerged over the last few years related to the large-scale impacts of human activities on nature and subsequent impacts on the society and economy that's linked to consumption behavior, industrial and business practices, and government development policies. We examined over 200 reports and studies, and in our report, we offer two tables that really shows the scale of this impact that human behavior is making on nature, particularly focusing on ocean, land, atmosphere, and fresh water, as well as biodiversity, and subsequently how these losses and these impact will have an impact on the society. Just to highlight a few points, roughly about 50% of world's GDP is dependent on natural capital. Natural ecosystem services provide benefits of around 125 to 140 trillion US dollars per year. This is roughly over 1.5 times of the global GDP. Large economies have the highest share of GDP in nature-dependent sectors. For example, China, 18.9% of the GDP, EU 15.9%, and the United States, 9.8% of GDP relies on nature and nature-based solutions. Nature-dependent sectors generate 15% of the global GDP, and I want to highlight particularly the three top being construction, agriculture, and livestock, food and beverages, which ultimately, with the loss of nature and natural capital, could potentially be deeply impacted. Next slide, please. Climate change and nature-based systems are profoundly interlinked. We cannot address climate change without considerations for nature. I would like to highlight about 3 points in this. First, there is now significant research that nature-based systems are a critical part of climate change solutions, particularly by serving as a buffer against extreme weather events, as well as leading to increased carbon sinks, which is increasingly now linked to the regulated and voluntary carbon markets. Now, on the other hand, as the world moves to decarbonization by large-scale deployment of new climate technologies, we need to be highly mindful of potential environmental risk of these new technologies across the value chain, from mining to transportation, manufacturing, operation, and ultimately disposal of new climate tech. For example, batteries, solar panels, wind turbines, carbon capture and storage, as I mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. One of the things I wanted to highlight that besides direct impact of nature on society and economy, there are 7 other external factors that we believe are moving consideration for nature into core business decision for governments, for the private sector, and subsequently for their insurers and investors. We highlighted these 7 factors in the report with examples, but I wanted to particularly point out first the developments for developing methodologies for quantifying financial risk of nature, based risks and opportunity, which is happening through the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosure. Secondly, I want to highlight regulatory action by a number of different international and national regulators. I want to highlight NGFS, Sustainable Insurance Forum, and the Dutch regulator, who have now started to raise awareness about potential risk of nature loss for the insurance and financial sectors, And lastly, we see rising litigation, and particularly strategic litigation related to these issues, to try to push governments and corporations into better behavior. And the recent litigation case is a case against Coca-Cola and 6 other retail giants for dangerous plastic packaging and their impacts. Next slide, please. Now, in our report, we have started to look at the ways nature-related risk impact insurers, and we have found 4 ways: through vulnerability to extreme weather events and disease transmission. Loss of nature could also reduce GHG sequestration capacity, lead to unsustainable business model for companies, policy holders, as well as investees. And ultimately, there are secondary impacts of poor public sector development choices and urbanization. Next slide, please. What this has led to is a number of insurance companies are already taking action by starting to invest in research, to look at data and evidence and quantifying these risks, to raise awareness, and very importantly, to develop solutions and innovate solutions both on the liability and investment side. In the report, we highlight 3 types of solutions on the liability side and 2 ways insurers are investing in nature, which we will discuss with examples during this webinar. And my last slide points to some of the challenges that insurers faced by way of really creating a market for these new innovative solutions. We've identified 4 challenges. First, around the general perception that still persists that nature and biodiversity may be exploited for free forever. So essentially, nature positive activities and investments are still not correctly priced and currently imply extra premium for which policyholders may not be willing to pay for. Identifying customers who benefit from these solutions and who would be willing to pay is certainly a challenge. Availability and accessibility of data and tools to quantify the risk and subsequently develop innovative solutions remains a challenge. And finally, need for enabling public policy and regulatory frameworks and government investment in this solution is something that needs to be addressed and scaled up. So with no further delay, let me turn to our panel. I'm going to be inviting our panelists to sort of offer a 3-minute statement on, with some questions that I will ask to start the conversation. So let's start with you, Eric. Thank you very much for being here. Well, the Nature Conservancy, in partnership with the insurance industry, has been working on research and innovation in this space to really collect data and evidence around both risks of nature, but also benefits of investing in nature-based solutions. Can you please elaborate on elements of this collaboration and why it's crucial? Over to you.
Sure. And thank you, Miriam, for the opportunity to speak with you and the other panelists today. It's really, really great to be here discussing these critically important topics. So, partnerships are certainly key to TNC's success. And that's no different whether we're trying to conserve land or if we're trying to establish, innovative ways to finance and repair ecosystems and the valuable services they provide, such as risk reduction or sustenance or livelihoods, in addition to all the co-benefits such as critical breeding and feeding grounds for various species. I think it would be helpful maybe just to give a little bit of backstory about how we got into this, which is, in 2005, Hurricane Wilma struck the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, caused nearly $8 billion in damage. Now, there's a little coastal tourism-focused town called Puerto Morelos. It suffered significantly less damage than the other communities. And it turns out there was a really well-established section of the Mesoamerican Reef just offshore. So the hotel associations, the government officials, others in the community, they understood the importance of protecting the tourism industry because it was the foundation of the local economy. they had an inkling that the reef might be providing some degree of coastal protection, but they didn't really know how much, or they didn't have a way to actually quantify that protection. So working with our partners, we modeled the economic benefits provided by the reefs in terms of flood risk reduction, and providing those benefits in dollar figures. It was really a game.
Oh, Eric, you went on mute.
Oh, sorry about that.
There you go.
Accidentally
No
hit a
worries.
button. It really was a game changer. It built widespread understanding among the business community about the value that coral reefs provided to them. At the same time, research was showing that hurricanes could cause significant damage to coral reefs in a very short amount of time. And so there's a challenge there. If your reefs are being damaged, but you think that they're also providing benefits, what are you going to do about it? We also knew from decades of experience managing ecosystems and developing restoration techniques that restoring coral reefs and the services they provide is a very expensive business. So with the local communities and the stakeholders, we set out how can we protect the tourism economy while providing benefits to nature. We needed a way to be able to access significant capital quickly when it was most needed, right after a hurricane, so that we could actually start to repair the reef and ensure that it continues to provide the flood risk reduction benefits. And insurance appeared to be a very good tool to cover those types of costs. And so we started working with Swiss Re to design and structure the world's first parametric policy for coral reefs, which I'm sure many of you on the line have heard about. Since then, we've worked with WTW, AXA XL, Swiss Re, Munich Re, with generous support from the Howden Foundation, the Swiss Re Foundation, the Bank of America Charitable Foundation, among others, to do a range of different projects in this area. So we've assessed the feasibility of reef insurance in Hawaii and Florida. We recently placed the first parametric policy on coral reefs in the United States in the state of Hawaii. We've explored other risks such as sedimentation and coral bleaching. We've assessed the potential for wildfire resilience insurance. We've conducted mangrove insurance feasibility assessments. We're starting a marsh insurance feasibility assessment, and we've looked at the potential benefits of nature-based flood mitigation with community-based flood insurance products. So really a wide range of opportunity, I think, for partnership between conservation and the insurance industry.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. So what I take from here is the expertise and years of experience that you've had in this field has come in and sort of complemented what insurers can bring to the table. Let me turn to you, Sherry. What Eric mentioned is the critical importance of foundations in supporting the research and development. But how do we take this collaboration and move it from philanthropy into core business? What is the role of insurers and how can they do this as part of their core business?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I guess Swiss Re is a global reinsurer, and our purpose is making the world more resilient. And we've been doing that for, over 150 years. We're working to close what we call the protection gap, which is the gap between what's insured and what's not. And that includes nature, which is a critical asset and service that we depend on, but an enormously exposed risk. So I guess, why is it really relevant for insurers? I mean, firstly, as Eric points out, nature has a critical role in mitigating and building resilience to physical climate risk. We're all seeing the increased frequency and severity of weather events. We know nature absorbs carbon. We know reefs and mangroves reduce storm surge. We know healthier soil absorbs the rain and reduces flooding. So we need to support the conservation restoration of these proven solutions. And secondly, there's a growth opportunity here. As your stats point out, Miriam, over half global GDP is dependent on biodiversity and ecosystem services. And nature needs to be acknowledged as the exposed revenue generating asset that it is. And the insurance industry has products and solutions to help manage this exposure. And so for us as reinsurers, we're in the business of identifying and managing risk. And so that's why Swiss Re built what we call our Biodiversity and Ecoservices Index. And it's a map that shows 10 different ecosystem layers and their state of vulnerability. And what we did was we've integrated this into our CatNet system. which is our perils database. So that's used by over 15,000 organisations, and what they can do is they can look at a location, they can see the historic exposure to flooding, cyclones, earthquakes, but also get a picture of the ecosystem health at that site. And there's also a big opportunity to increase the use of parametric insurance products to support early intervention and fast response. And, you know, the reef case studies are a fantastic example of this. And it's so cool to see the original model being replicated because it validates the design, right? It shows how effective these parametric designs can be. The concept's been proven, you know, and with Hawaii coming on now, we're actually creating a market, right, for this. And lastly, we need to mainstream nature positive actions. So as an industry, we need to encourage our clients to acknowledge their dependencies and impacts on nature and help them manage that risk accordingly. We need to extend insurance programs to include the green assets as well as the grey ones. We can provide construction covers, for example, for large-scale nature-based engineering. And we also need to recognise the developing markets and industries coming out of this space. And I guess back to the reef, the reef brigades are a great example of this. You know, the team's actually doing the hard work, the restoration work. And so to see, because Swiss Re Foundation provided the original grant to catalyse it, and then to help expand the training across Mexico, Belize, Honduras, Guatemala. And I think, Eric, correct me if I'm wrong, there's about probably 14 brigades now along that coast, providing jobs as well as community engagement. But it's also creating a new industry and a skill set of coastal resilience management. So there's a lot of considerations for insurers, but also a lot of opportunity and a lot of growth.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sherry. To both of you, we will come back. I want to dig a bit deeper about some of these solutions, from sort of idea generation to innovation to actually market creation. But let me move to Jonathan. Jonathan, we talked about, link of nature loss and unsustainable business model across many sectors. And at Zurich, you've been working to innovate solutions for incentivizing more sustainable business model in some of the industries that are particularly impacting nature or will be impacted by that. Could you expand a little bit about sort of core business solutions that could be offered related to nature for enabling more sustainable business model across different sectors?
Sure. Thank you, Miriam. Thank you for having Zurich as a representative on this panel. So Zurich, like many top carriers, is aligned with the view of taking nature front and center in our role of sustainability. We believe that nature will provide protection, risk reduction properties with insurance, and insurance companies really across the board should be interested in this. And the insurance companies really must, consistently look at this to develop innovative products that not only attract customers we want to insure, but provide capacity and encourage the economic growth that we want to see and where we want to see it. Many of these products can link nature, resilience, and support sustainable business models. And we can look at traditional sectors like construction. We have noticed many organizations understand the need to sequester carbon as one aspect of being nature positive. The desire to be more sustainable, cost-effective, environmentally friendly materials becomes a greater priority for architects, owners, project managers, and general contractors. Mass timber provides one potential solution to support the construction industry while developing a more sustainable and nature positive method for construction. With sustainable forestry, proper sourcing, and life cycle management, including recycling and sequestering wood, there is a potential for carbon neutral and even carbon negative buildings when you exclude operating costs. So if we look at various scholarly journals, so in Nature Sustainability, they had a report came out in 2022 or an analysis titled Buildings as a Sustainable Carbon Sink, just quoting that directly. Mass timber is a safer way to store carbon than pumping CO2 underground and is more useful and economically viable option then burying logs in trenches under a thick layer of soil for long-term storage or direct conversion of roundwood into biochar. Most notably, the carbon pools in timber cities have been maintained and gradually enhanced along with forest pools to ensure long-term lock-in carbon on land, which can be achieved through more durable construction, detailing, and promotes longer timber buildings lifespan, stimulating markets for used wood and for technologies that convert used wood into other long-living products along the sustainable management of forests. So it also could be then encouraging a circular economy. So it has actually further knock-on effects. With mass timber, there are new risks such as understanding fire risks, water damage risks, supply chains, and more that insurance companies need to consider as they are developing these new products. However, it does not always necessarily take these brand new innovative products to support nature and sustainability. We could look at long used ideas of captives and group captives as another way that we can support sustainability. A captive can provide capacity when a market's availability is limited or terms and conditions are not favorable. Captives, and specifically in group captives, can be used not only to support an underlying business operations through insurance, but can develop can be developed to support sustainably minded companies through a way that they are risk sharing and also not knowledge sharing their best practices and ideas with each other and actually together lifting each other up. So there are ways through innovative structures as well as innovative products to develop many nature positive solutions within the industry.
Excellent, Jonathan. I also see flow of questions coming from the audience, which we will get to, but there are questions around how do we set GHG emissions and how potentially coming to the subject of this discussion and what we have shared in our report, how could nature-based solutions be part of implementation plan for setting the net zero targets in an insurance industry? And I think you also shared some ideas about some of these innovative solutions that you can have for your policy holders and subsequently for benefits that you could have on your own net zero targets by way of what you're offering also to your clients. But we will come back to that. And also I want to again tell everyone, please use the chat function to share your information, but if you have any questions, send it through Q&A. Now, let me move to Brian. Brian, you're representing the other side of the balance sheet. And certainly on the investment side, Manulife has been quite innovative around new strategies for investing in sustainable business model and nature-based solutions. So over to you, what are your thoughts from the other side of the balance sheet? How should insurance be thinking about investing in nature?
Yeah, thank you, Miriam, and thanks to the Geneva Association for taking on this super important topic and for having Manulife Investment Management part of the webinar today. So as a wildlife biologist by training, I've been measuring nature, protecting nature, and really managing natural resources and natural systems my entire career. And I have to say that until just recently, with important works such as the Dasgupta Review, the World Economic Forum risk reports that you've highlighted, and now your report, that directly show the linkages of nature to economies, nature to the insurance business, and nature to really human health. You know, the world hasn't understood the importance of nature to the vitality of the planet. I loved Eric's example of it was the moment that the coral reefs were put into dollar signs, economics associated with it, that really spurred the action that TNC and Swiss Re were able to accomplish. That's what's being highlighted now, I think, in a much more granular way and specific way, such as in your report. So my comments are this. Let me start with the opportunity, and I'll be general but quite simple here, which is the opportunity is that nature loss as a global crisis has really come to the forefront. And it's because of a lot of the work that you and others have done, which means that, we're now incentivized, I think, as a community in the investment world to do something about it. And that truly is the underlying opportunity that I think we see. So if I have a simple answer to whether or not investing in nature will become core business, have to say yes, or at least I sure hope so. And I think there's some challenges that we have to overcome to make that a reality. So as somebody in the investment management space, I see the primary challenge this way. So until we assign value to nature, as some are doing, we really can't invest in it. Until we invest in nature, we can't really begin to create that nature positive world. So it all does hinge on the ability to assign value, such as the examples that we're starting to hear on this webinar. The value of nature, though, has to come from our ability to measure it. We can't manage what we can't measure. We have to understand, as Sherry said, the business impacts and dependencies on nature. And I think the primary challenge here in these early days is that taxonomies, standards, and the fundamental data are really serious challenges. So nature is ultimately more complex than climate, and it's very local. And I'll talk about this as we go a little bit further. But where climate can be distilled down into a kind of a single global metric, nature does not and will not have a corollary to that. Lastly, I'll say from a challenge, but I also have optimism we can overcome it, is disclosure and regulation are necessary, but nonetheless challenging as we begin to invest in nature positive economies. Think about the finance sector. If we didn't have accounting standards, if we didn't have regulations, if we didn't have an expectation for full and transparent disclosure, why would we expect anything less if we now put a value on nature? So getting there will be messy and frustrating, but until we can get to appropriate disclosure and likely through rational regulation, nature will remain an externality without the attention that it deserves. So maybe I'll stop there and let the questions tease out a lot of the details.
Have raised so many issues. We just finished a major study on the GA Task Force climate related risk assessment, and it's very challenging for climate, let alone when we get into the nature. And I guess there is a lot that we can learn from how we tackled climate, some of the things that is working and some that are not, in terms of how to go in there. So we will come back to some of your comments, and I also see that there is a list of questions from the audience on that, which I will come back to after a few questions that I will be asking the panelists. Let me come back to Sherry and Eric. Sherry, starting with you, I think one of the questions that I see is we always hear about benefits of solutions, but we never hear about costs. And I want to come back to the comment that two of you made around the fact of how philanthropy and, money is going into collecting data and doing the research and creating the evidence that it's needed to start quantifying nature so that you can actually start finding solutions and innovating solutions to answer it. Can we take the case of coral reefs in Mexico and subsequently the solution in Hawaii, which was just announced? And I want to ask you, how can you take these examples and make it standard practice? Is every case is going to be customized, requiring its own research? Or do you envision a day where insurance companies globally can actually start coming up with standard products and services for nature-based solutions that have all these benefits? So tell me about the costs and the benefits and how we can move towards making these part of standard solutions that industry offers. First with you, Sherry.
Thank you. Well, I guess it probably leads into the standard, challenges, around making this a reality. Because, data is a challenge. And so that's why making sure that we start with the pilots, making sure that we actually can replicate what we know works is a really great start, because, you know, insurance is about underwriting. It's about having the data to kind of put in the models and actually make the forecasts and probabilities. So until we actually have the data and until we can actually look at the performance, you can't actually create, you know, the pricing models. You can't actually look at the material benefits yet of putting those things in place. So that's really important. The sooner we start collecting the data, then the sooner we can start mainstreaming and commercializing and building up the capability. So, I mean, that's why parametric insurance is a really great place to start, because it's a pre-agreed contract and the payout amounts can be based on the estimated costs of restoration, labor and materials, like what we've done in the Reef examples. Whereas, you know, the actuaries and accountants have got a really important role to play in this. But until we get, you know, established, I guess, practices, until we get a market of really skilled loss adjusters, solutions like parametric ones are just a really fantastic way to get us started.
Great. And Eric, from your perspective, I mean, obviously TNC and a number of other organizations such as yours, for example, Conservation International, you're all working heavily with the scientific side, with the insurance side. How can we take this from experiment and pilots into large-scale solutions from your part? Can you expand a little bit on, you know, how can we really scale up these partnerships to get into market solutions? And maybe you can give us a bit of more about what happened from Mexico to Hawaii and share with us, you know, you went from collaboration with Swiss Re to Willis Tower Watson and Munich Re to come up with a new solution. Give us a little bit more about that and what's in the horizon.
Sure. So, you know, as Cherie mentioned, you know, the Reef Insurance model is, I think we are well on our way to market development. You know, Kitanaru was essentially the foundational research and the pilot. That concept was adopted and adapted to Belize, Honduras, and another portion of Mexico by Willis Towers Watson and the MAR Fund. And then we worked with Willis Towers Watson to assess the feasibility of reef insurance in Hawaii and Florida. And ultimately, that helped us to place the policy in Hawaii with Munich Re. You know, in my opinion, the Hawaii project really shows that the concept for insurance for nature can be applied, and including in highly regulated and developed markets. You know, we're now assessing the feasibility of reef insurance in the Bahamas, and I understand Willis Towers Watson has also explored the opportunity in various Caribbean countries, and the Asian Development Bank is now looking to establish reef insurance in Asia Pacific. You know, I think to some degree, the modeling and the process to develop the insurance product will become more standardized. I think it's always going to be a little bit bespoke when it comes to figuring out who pays and what's the ecosystem of institutional relationships needed to buy the insurance, manage the payouts, do the response, and be able to actually repair the ecosystems. And that, I mean, there's a model and a guide framework to follow to do that, but it does require a significant amount of figuring out, you know, relationships at the local level. And so that part will always take a bit of extra time.
Thank you so much. I want to come back to this, but just if I get it right, just to summarize from what I hear from you both is data and the research that it's needed to really get to assessing the risk, finding those customers that can benefit from these solutions, role of government and innovation. And then very importantly, Eric, you highlighted role of development banks, particularly in certain parts of the world, and access to local information. So this is where partnerships with entities that are present on the ground, deeply involved in the process of restoration of nature is actually critical for entering and developing these new markets. Let me come back to, yes, Jonathan, go ahead, please.
Yeah, can I jump in? So one
Yes,
thing
of
that
course.
makes this very interesting. So, I'm putting on my X-ray hat and in a prior life as a biologist, who actually spent time studying on the Great Barrier Reef. So this is one of those places that when we talk about damage to reefs, each reef is extremely unique. The geography around the reef, the depth of the reef, so we could talk about a reef that is 10 meters deep or shallower versus a 20, 30, 40 meter deep reef. You're gonna have to have a completely different wind speeds at the surface to have the water surge at those depths to actually cause damage. And then you have the geography around it. Is there a cove that's actually protecting it a little bit more, or is it more open? So then you got to start understanding how that geography and how those depths are actually going to impact it. So while it's never going to be as simple and out of the box as ISO forms in the US and for auto liability and things along those lines, but there is definitely great progress in making this a more accepted idea as we could prove that it provides resilience, that there is benefits to the reefs and resilience in protecting local economies and encouraging local economies so they're not going to move away from tourism and move towards overfishing. But it's also one of those places that every reef is going to need to have studies around it, because you're going to want to make sure it's structured in a way that you're not going to be over insuring it, that that there's not going to be damage and there's a payout, because then you get to places where an insurance company may not be able to call it insurance from an accounting standpoint, which causes issues. And also on the flip side, you don't want to be in a situation where there is severe damage to the reef and there is no payout in a parametric scenario, because that causes both economic damage, and now people in that local economy could lose trust in the insurance sector, which is something that we don't want to happen. So by having those proper studies, we could ensure that we're not going to create a society that, and a lot of times these reefs are in developing nations that lose trust in insurance, when this may be one of the first times they actually get to see how insurance could actually provide extreme benefit towards them.
Fundamental point around parametric insurance, and we even observed that for example, in case of the regional pools that were established for managing hurricane risk in the Caribbean or the Pacific, and the basis risk that's involved with parametric insurance. So this is a very important point about that extra bit of research that needs to be done to develop these innovative solutions. And we will come back to some of these points. But now let me come back to you, Brian and Jonathan. And I want to look at the two sides of the balance sheet when we think about enabling sustainable business model for certain industries, being agriculture or being construction. I think you both, your organizations from the Zurich side has been working on underwriting mass timber, whereas Brian, you've personally have been responsible for developing a whole new strategy for investing in mass timber. So let me first point to Jonathan on the underwriting side. Give us some concrete example of what would these products look like, and sort of a deeper look at how does the construction business benefits from these sustainable solutions that you offer. And then I want to come back to you, Brian, and see what does it mean from the investment side. All
right, so mass timber has been growing in the industry. It really started out in Europe, as a lot of these sustainable ideas have started out, I want to say around 1990 or so. And it's been growing. We've seen international building codes and other areas like that with, start taking these ideas into consideration. But what we've seen is the traditional builder's risk products that we've seen in the market, they generally don't respond in a way that many insurance companies are comfortable providing capacity. And what that means is if a construction company cannot find insurance capacity, they're either having to find it in some, in some other ways where people are drastically reducing coverage, or it gets to some very cost prohibitive areas which then get passed back to the actual ultimate owner of the building, where they may decide they are not going to go down this route, and the architects and them all decide to go down a more traditional building route. So we took a view that we want to help encourage this growing industry of sustainable buildings within the United States. So we took a view of, we need to understand what are the various risks, how do those compare to all the different type of building, from your standard stick construction, tilt wall, steel beam, and so forth. Understand where do we think these different risks, would they exist in those other buildings? Are they greater? Are they less? And where would we need to look at our current coverages? Where are places that we would have to potentially, we could increase coverage? Where are places that we think, okay, well, we need to readjust how we cover, so we could still be affirmative and cover these products, but we also want, as well as where do we need to maybe say this is not necessarily need a change in coverage, but we need to say, okay, this is something that, that we need to understand who is actually producing the cross-laminated timber. Do they actually understand what they're doing? So we're not just underwriting the construction company, but we need to work with them and understand who their suppliers are. Are their suppliers, skilled? Are their suppliers actually know what they're doing? Do they have the proper equipment? Have they have proven use cases of doing this in the past? So we could feel comfortable saying, yep, you guys are getting the proper supplies and you guys are doing it from known commodities. So we feel comfortable providing capacity. Now, what that does is we are now able to provide, I think we are, as a lead carrier, are able to offer $50 million per capacity, but which may not sound like a large amount, but what that does is we've had many times, we become now a lead player where other insurance companies, excuse me, become a follow on that, where they take additional lines on top of it. So Zurich actually is building the market in this sense. So our construction team has set a form, and other carriers have been attaching to it, saying, yep, we like this form. We have brokers who like the coverage, and the fact that we're out there providing affirmative cover and actually helping create the market with our underwriting guidelines. And so we could actually provide coverage, provide capacity, and actually support an industry as opposed to running away from an industry.
This is so important, Brian. Before coming to, I think what you're pointing is some of the strategic, fundamental decision you make inside the company on how to approach an industry, and taking it with a full supply chain approach on one hand, but also internally to really think about, the whole culture and approach of your own experts and underwriters in this that needs to be addressed. What about the investment side, Brian? What has it meant for you on the investment side to develop these strategies?
Yeah, so I'll this is a fantastic example, because I'll take this emerging mass timber industry and back up into the supply chain to remind everyone where the materials come to build the infrastructure, right? So now we're back to a new industry that wants to build more with wood, and we have to recognize that raw material is coming from the forest. And from an investment perspective, we're the largest investment manager of timberland for institutional investors. So we know what it takes to kind of do so credibly and sustainably. And I think as the industry continues, what is another risk is that your supply of the raw materials making the material for the ultimate building construction is coming from unsustainable management. And so I appreciated the opportunity to have the case study in the report about our timberland and agriculture business as a sustainable business model. And I'll just comment a minute on how we think you have to underpin the management of nature to provide those raw materials to do something that has all of the benefits that Jonathan described. And the crux of it is now really rooted in kind of double materiality. So of course, investment business, financial risk, investment risk, of course, core to our fiduciary duty. But ever increasing, we've had to layer in the materiality of the impacts on the environment and society of our activities, reputational components, but also kind of the true risks and opportunities of nature and people associated with managing those forests. And so we've taken that approach to give you a sense of what that looks like generally for the forest land sector, the timber investment sector. You'll start with people empowerment as a material element. You'll speak about community prosperity. These are often rural communities and where you have the economies dependent on the procurement of these raw materials. You have then on the nature side, climate change, and making sure that we're not diminishing the forest's capability to provide climate benefits. Ecosystem resilience, making sure that forest ecosystem is resilient and can withstand proper management. And then, of course, in timber and agriculture, both watershed protection, the importance of making sure that we're not destroying another benefit of forests in the process of managing it. So that gives a sense of the complexity that a sustainable business model providing this raw material is going to have to look at. That's our framework. Others have their own, but it's rooted in that double materiality where we can look at both financial and environmental and societal benefits and risks associated with it. It's also necessary once you do that to then, as I commented earlier, to be transparent, to be rigorous, and to be prepared to disclose the information associated with that. We voluntarily subscribe to third-party independent certification of our practices in both our timberland and agriculture businesses because we know society cares where their materials come from. And that's a pretty standard practice these days in investment of timberland, becoming a standard in the investment of agriculture, but a necessary, as I commented, practice that we have to undertake to ensure and be accountable to the sustainable business that we have in order to enable nature to provide for a new industry with the benefits such as mass timber.
Excellent, thank you. I want to come back to all of you around challenges. So you introduced the concept of double materiality, which we've confronted, also dealing with the climate change related issues. We've discussed issues related to regulation. So I want to come back to you guys asking about your views about the nature-related financial disclosure task force that's developing methodologies. But I'm going to hold that back and go to some questions that have been raised by the audience. And for example, Michael Gorley asks us, with limited funding for now, who assesses the opportunity for the biggest real impact and how to direct the funding towards developing these cases for producing some business solutions? So let me come back to Eric and Sherry. Are there any studies that tries to bring focus on hotspot areas where we really need to invest more work to really come up with some of these innovative insurance solutions? Is there, beyond these pilots, is there any focus on, if we take the globe, where does it make sense for us to put our focus and bring the industry as a whole? Do you know of any such studies underway?
Well, maybe just a few quick thoughts. I think at least in terms of the reef insurance, I don't know a specific study saying, this is where you should try the insurance for coral reefs, but there have been certainly a number of studies showing, where are the most valuable coral reefs for whatever number of variables, whether that's the resilience to climate change, to resilience to heat events, their value for coastal protection, or their value for fisheries or tourism. And so those can really be studies that help to focus, like where do we start to work on coral reef insurance, for example. With the mangrove insurance, we've been doing feasibility studies on that. And across the broader Caribbean, we've identified a number of places, especially Florida, Mexico, and the Bahamas, where it's cost effective to do insurance or to do restoration of mangroves for their flood risk reduction benefits. So some of those types of studies will help us to identify locations where it might make sense. But at the end of the day, for an insurance for nature approach to work, you have to have the buy-in from the local stakeholders, and you won't know that until you actually go out and start to do the work. You also need to make sure that there's capacity to be able to respond, and if that capacity can or cannot be built. And in terms of coral reefs, you also need to be thinking about, are there other local stressors that are hindering this reef to a point where even if we had an insurance payout, we couldn't restore the function of the reef. So there's a lot of factors that will go into deciding where is the insurance for nature approach most applicable.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sherry. Let me come back to you on this. Yeah.
Yeah, if I can add to that, because I mean, just on the notion of prioritization, regardless of the ecosystem, for any kind of insurance, it needs someone to pay the premium. Right. So it means that it needs someone to actually recognize and prioritize that paying a premium is a worthwhile investment or use of the available budget that they have. And so I think this is certainly a role for government, which I guess are responsible for a lot of the public assets and nature-based assets that we have. But one of the things that we're seeing is a lot of local municipalities, taking action as well. So we've done some great work, and this is where the engineers can play a fantastic role, because seeing local municipalities such as what we did in the Netherlands with Texel Island, where rather than actually replacing the concrete dike, they actually reinforced it with sand, right? So they're doing a nature-based solution. So seeing the local municipality prioritize their spend to a more nature-based approach is a fantastic way to see that mindset change. In India, we're doing a project in Kochi where the canal restoration is actually a green-grey restoration. So I guess
green-grey a little bit, just for the audience to understand.
Yeah, so it's a mix of, I guess, the green nature-based with the grey being the traditional kind of concrete bricks and mortar. So if you think about, the canals with their concrete kind of walls, but they can be actually restored in a much more organic substance. And you can also integrate the planting and the trees to actually help improve the water quality as well. And so it's also about being able to direct the funding that usually happens at a federal level, because you have a lot of pledges and policies set at federal government level, but it's actually local governments that actually need to take action. So if we can actually get that prioritization right within the budget allocations, then that's where we're going to be able to have a lot of impact.
Raised a number of important points going back to that whole issue of, a lot of these solutions are localized, which Brian also alluded to. And as a result, these partnerships, for example, with organizations that are in the local communities are absolutely important. In addition, you raised the important role that government plays, not only at the municipal level for the implementation part, but probably from public policy and regulatory side. I'm looking at the questions that are coming online, and there's questions about regulations. So let me go back and come to you, Brian, and then colleagues that are working on the underwriting side. So clearly, following the launch of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures about 2 years ago, Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure was established, which has insurers as members. We are expecting recommendations of this task force by next year. And the whole idea is, how can we really assess methodologies to assess impact of nature and then subsequently disclosure of it. But obviously, we've learned a lot from the climate side, and we know that these are very challenging issues. I want to come back to you, Brian, first around what have we learned from climate that we can now apply to nature, and what do you see by way of critical challenges that the industry faces in terms of developing methodologies for measuring financial risk of nature that then can lead to better management approaches?
Yeah, so I think the parallel of TNFD, the Net Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, with TCFD, the climate disclosures, is a very important development. We were on the informal working group that was really assessing whether to even do a TNFD, and we're supportive of it, because I think on the positive side, well, on the similarity side, what we have seen with TCFD is the rapid uptake of it by regulators, right? Which is the need to disclose became real, and having TCFD on the ready, voluntarily developed with broad collaboration, made it a very suitable place to go to pick up the means by which most probably could accept disclosure around climate. So I think on that side of the frame, the fact that we're into beta version 4 or so of TNFD, I think we'll see a much more rapid move to adopt the recommendations of TNFD as the means by which we disclose nature-related risks. So on that case, it was a commonality. Plenty of folks would suggest that maybe these two, because as you pointed out, the highly related nature of climate and nature, maybe they become one, maybe they become parallels, and we surely would look for that efficiency ourselves as we try to disclose on both, and you really can't start to separate them eventually. On the differences, I'll go back to my nature is just far more complex than climate. And Jonathan did a nice job of giving you some of the technical stuff around reefs and what it means to really understand those. You can multiply that many times over for different ecosystems around the world. And I think that's the challenge of TNFD. It will be a framework that works, but a framework is what it is. The means by which we measure, the means by which we account for nature will not be as simple as climate accounting. A ton of carbon equivalent is a ton of carbon equivalent globally, and it means we can have one metric, but we can also have one goal, right? Decrease that. Nature will have to figure it out. So we have to pair alongside TNFD, in my view, the technology, the capability to do natural capital accounting, right? We have to provide the framework by which you account for it, not just the framework by which you disclose. And I think that's going to be an important element that I would argue we're Dasgupta did a nice job of highlighting the need for this, but I would say we're still a little slow on the uptake to put those tools in place. We've done some pilot testing on it. It's tough. It's specialized depending on what you're trying to account for. And that takes me back to the data challenges that have been discussed already.
Thank you so much. So let me come back to you, Jonathan, Sherry,
Yep.
and Eric on the other side. Jonathan, maybe you want to make some comments from your perspective on the underwriting side, particularly related to how can we use these methodologies to create decision useful information by way of which companies can develop their strategy, they can develop new innovative products and services.
Yep, thank you. So as Brian mentioned here, TNFD is still evolving. And over time, we should hopefully see conversations and commitments that move beyond net zero and could talk about no impact, positive nature impact to specific geographies and biomes. And with TNFD, we should have the ability to talk more about nature-related risks, as nature can be viewed as an asset on balance sheets, which means then we can move into an area where we could think about how do we protect that nature that is specifically required in said company's supply chain, in how they operate as a going forward concern. And then we could work with them to create solutions. Maybe those solutions, as Sherry mentioned, a lot of times as they are nascent areas, parametrics is a very strong way of looking at something, specifically when you don't have a set group of claim adjusters and you got to understand what is the financial risk. And we could then address that financial risk with a parametric. When X happens, we could pay Y as long as we could show that there is an actual insured loss there. But when we talk about TNFD and biomes, as companies will be reporting on biomes, which is one of those big things in TNFD, since we're not just talking about nature, we're talking about biomes and geographies that are direct concern on the balance sheet. However, the world is interconnected, and polluting and negative impacts in one biome can have knock-on consequences. Companies may realize it takes more than protecting their specific biomes of interest to actually protect their biomes of interest. And I think that's an important thing that a lot of companies may realize, that if I care about a lake in Wisconsin because that's where I get X for my business, it may not just be protecting that specific lake, but then its areas around there could actually have also negative consequences on that lake. So now I got to think about what can I do as a company to actually provide positive impact to those areas around that. But then there's stuff that's interconnected there, and really over a larger horizon, TNFD actually puts a framework for companies to think about how can they be not just nature positive to the areas that they are interested in, but then that really, as a spider web grows, how could they be nature positive across the whole globe?
Excellent. Sherry, Eric, just 30-minute responses if you want to add anything to this discussion of TNFD, because we're running out of time and I still want to ask you one more thing before we wrap up. Sherry? Yeah.
Oh, I guess I'll just add that, yeah, TNFD is just going to be, I guess, an amazing catalyst for action as well, because we know that no one's going to disclose unless they have, appropriate solutions in place. So I think it's going to be great in terms of, generating true value on nature, opening up biodiversity credits, as a market, and I guess, commercializing nature positive action. So I think it's going to be really interesting.
Thank you. And Eric, any points on this one you'd like to share?
I mean, I think the colleagues on the panel here are certainly more well versed in TNFD than I. I think the only thing I would add is, I really do hope that the disclosure does lead to actually changing the balance sheet and having companies invest in nature positive. That will be the ultimate. So.
Excellent. And I can share with you that from the experience that we had with the GA Task Force on Climate-related risk assessment, which evolved out of TCFD. I think the point that we try to reflect is around the fact that these kind of risk assessments that are sort of being developed should really produce decision useful information for companies and regulatory bodies, and not just be a checkbox for disclosure. I mean, the whole purpose of doing all of this is to generate information on risk and opportunities by way of which companies, governments, financial sector, and others can act towards a sort of net zero nature positive economy. There is a question from the audience on what role can regulations play to incentivize this, but we are getting close to the closing of this webinar. So let me combine that in my closing question for you, and I will ask you if you can keep your closing remarks to maybe 1.5 minutes, as we are really close to the end of this. And here is my question. So with all these developments, with all these opportunities that we see before us, the role that government and regulation can play to help expedite this, so on and so forth. Imagine 5 years from now, where are we with this conversation? Have we transformed this into actual action? And what do you think needs to be done at the industry level, and what needs to be done at the company level to really realize these growth opportunities that we discussed in this webinar? So let me start with you, Eric. Any thoughts on where are we 5 years from now and how are we going to get there?
Sure, thanks, Miriam. And it's really hard to say where we'll be in 5 years. I know where I hope we'll be. But what I do know is that, taking the current projects and initiative to scale, really, it won't happen at a scale and pace that matters unless there's broader acceptance among the insurance industry about the value of nature-based solutions. And I think to get to that point, what we really need is bold leadership from the insurance industry. And that could look like a range of things. It could be supporting applied research to establish fragility curves, helping people understand what are the limits of various ecosystems to provide risk reduction benefits. It could be building tools to help potential policyholders actually understand and evaluate their risks and assess the risk reduction benefits of nature-based solutions. It could also be thinking creatively about who is the customer. When it comes to a public resource like nature being insured, we have to maybe think differently about what customer actually means, and also about how to finance those premiums, and not just wait for the community of potential beneficiaries to come up with the idea, but help them think about those innovative ways to finance premiums as well. And then I think finally, of course, continuing to partner with organizations like TNC is needed. And I would also add just, communicating the importance of these issues to your colleagues and to your peers across the industry. So thanks again, Miriam, for inviting TNC to be on today's panel.
Absolutely a pleasure having you. Sherry, over to you. Any last thoughts?
Yeah, well, I guess 5 years ago, we were talking about, this crazy idea for Mexico Reef, right? So in 5 years' time, I believe that we will absolutely be continuing to replicate these models. There's so much more out there to do. At COP today, they'll be talking about how we've got to reach our 30 by 30, right? I think we're only covering about 1% of reef so far, with just the Mesoamerican reef in Hawaii. So we do all need to step up and grow this market, commercially and sustainably, and spread our reach as an industry. I do also hope in 5 years' time that, that the government is prioritizing their spend and investment in this space, and that we cease to become dependent on grants to solve what is a commercial problem. So we all do need to educate our clients, especially the public sector clients, and encourage them to think more commercially and invest in natural assets the same way they invest in their dikes, their bridges, their roads, and their social infrastructure. And we also need to get ready for these new markets, okay, like the emissions disclosures and the net zero pledges. Seeing the boom of carbon markets, TNFD will catalyze new markets. And we need to make sure as an industry that, these markets are durable, they've got the right assurance, and they're effective and sustainable, right? Delivering the right outcomes, the nature positive outcomes.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Jonathan, Brian, you only have 1 minute each, and then I have to close. But any last thoughts?
Ultimately, I think that this panel is a group of people who are optimistic of the future. We've taken a path that, we are not going down the easy path. We view that this is an important path, and we wouldn't be here if we didn't believe that we all as an industry could make a positive difference. So I think my opinion is, I believe 5 years in the future, we will be in a position better than we expect to be in, but we will still in 5 years in the future say we have more work to be done, because we will still have a lot more work to do.
Thank you.
I'll pick up on Jonathan. Yeah, I'll pick up on Jonathan's point. I'm equally the optimist that we will be further along than we were when we got serious about climate change. It took way too long to get climate change to the forefront. I'm optimistic nature will be on a faster path in 5 years. TNFD will be expected. I sure hope government steps up and does its part. The Convention on Biological Diversity that's been referenced has to act to set some direction. Natural capital accounting needs to become a tool that we're all getting comfortable with. And then the last thing I'll say, and it's probably for a different conversation, is if you look at what happened with carbon and the price of carbon, it wasn't until we saw all of those things in the climate world come to fruition that you actually saw climate or carbon price in markets and voluntary markets go up to the point that it became investable. And so again, from an investment perspective, we have to see the value proposition be realized, whether it's biodiversity credits or something, to send a price signal to get investors to want to get in on the game, to put their capital to work on this. And once we see that, we're off to the races.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to all of you and to all the participants who were audience to this discussion. It's absolutely been a pleasure for me, together with my co-author, Adrienne Mello, to work on this report. We see it a beginning for moving ahead with a very important conversation, which needs to be come together with the discussion that we have on climate change by way of opportunities for the insurance industry in, enable and solve some of these grand challenges facing the world, but we need to stay practical and pragmatic and bring it down to core business. So this is just the beginning of really bringing these conversations together and translating it into what it means for creation of markets and opportunities through this critical catalyst industry as risk managers and investors. And with that, I want to thank you all for joining us in this conversation, and stay tuned because we will have more discussions about this issue as we look ahead. Thank you again. Have a wonderful day.